I think we are on. I think the workshop has begun. Welcome everybody to our celebration of 20 years of hard work and discovery with the Green Bank Telescope. This workshop will encompass everything from figuring out how to build it, to the business, to the science that was outlined in the beginning and what we're doing now. And we're going to look to the future as well. So we are super excited to see all of you, our friends, here with us today. So as you know, we have some speakers lined up and some panelists lined up. Oh, isn't it 11:03? What time is it?
10:57.
Nuh-uh.
It's 11.
It's 11:03.
11:03 is correct.
I got a message from our behind the scenes, Paul Vostine, who was telling me to wait until 11 to start, but it is after 11. So we're going to start again. So welcome everybody to the GBT at 20 workshop. We have a lot of fun talks and panel discussions lined up for everyone. And we also want you to participate as well. The chat feature is your friend. So we have lots of people that are going to be watching the chat. And if you would like to be, if you're an attendee and you would like to be elevated to a panelist position, that is to say, if you would like to speak or share something along the way, please do so. We're going to keep it light and fun and as participatory as possible. So the way it will work is that for the most part, if we have a speaker lined up, that speaker will have about 15 to 20 minutes to complete their remarks. All along the way, please put your ideas, your thoughts, and your questions in the chat and let us know if you'd like to speak out loud because we want to make that happen for you. We'll take some questions or comments after the talk. And then if we have a panelist session right after that, the panelists will speak on what they want to speak. They could speak about the talk that just happened before or tell a story related to that talk or the session topic. If a panelist wants to share their screen, you may do so. You should have that functionality. So feel free to do that. And let's keep this as participatory as possible. We will have a few trivia sessions for everybody to see what you know about the last 20 years of the GBT or the GBT itself. And Sophie is our poll master and our trivia creator. Sophie, where are you? Do you want to say howdy real quick? I don't know, she might be. I don't know if she's a panelist or not. Are you a panelist, Sophie? You love to, but you can't. Well, we'll fix that in a little bit and let you say howdy in a minute. So we're going to kick off with session one right now, and I'm going to turn it over to our session moderator, who is Mark McKinnon.
Thank you very much, Sue Ann. It's my pleasure to moderate our first session, A Telescope for All. And to kick things off, it's my pleasure to introduce Paul Vanden, our observatory director at the time the GBT was dedicated. Paul, it's all yours.
Thanks, Mark. This has been a real trip for me, recalling the past and looking at some videos and things, checking dates and stuff. I've really enjoyed it. I'll have to say that it's obvious, right? When the 300-foot telescope fell down, it was a big surprise. George was stunned when he got the call, and when he called me, I was stunned. We might have known, though, I stand to be corrected in the panel discussion, but I thought there had been rumors of the telescope complaining a bit, making funny noises. Not sure. After the fact, Condon discovered that the pointing was a little off. But in any event, after exceeding its lifetime by quite a bit, the 300-foot simply gave up. It was a real shock, and after the initial shock, we scrambled to control the situation. George was beset with media inquiries. AUI was in a complete panic to get a hold of the situation and establish some means of figuring out what happened, and hopefully it wouldn't be our fault. But after that, thinking about the whole thing, it was clear that the outlook for Green Bank was grim. We had one aging telescope on the ground, and the 140 foot was also an aging telescope. What would NSF do, you know, if they thought about it with a cold analytical mind? They might decide, why fund this place anymore? But of course, we all know Senator Byrd saved the day. He learned about the event very quickly. In retrospect, I'm wondering if I wasn't the second call George made that night. He had us into his office in no time, and with Senator Rockefeller and the director of the NSF, president of AUI, George, and myself, and he offered to help. Actually, Senator Rockefeller made the offer repeatedly. And Eric Bloch did not want to build a new telescope. At the dedication, Byrd said that the NSF director, he said Eric Bloch was cold. He was cold. And he was. He hemmed and hawed over proper procedure at NSF, proposals, priorities, review committees, blah, blah, blah. And Byrd got very red in the face. Actually, the day was saved by an offer from AUI to write a proposal to go through the system properly. And Senator Byrd thought that would be a good idea. So we went off to tell the community, the word spread quickly, I think, that a telescope would be built. And what would it be? We certainly wanted to be responsive to people's notions as to what should be built. There were a lot of suggestions, okay? And we had a workshop in Green Bank to thrash it all out in person. Bernie Burke was keen on a conventional large single dish that could do VLBI. He had championed such a dish in previous decadal surveys. It was straightforward. We knew how to do such a thing. There were no risks. That was the thing to do. Pat Thaddeus wanted to do spectroscopy of the interstellar medium. So he was keen on all frequencies. So now we had a big dish that would do all frequencies. Robert Brown from the Netherlands said, really what we ought to do is study neutral hydrogen with a big array of very small dishes, a lot of them. And then Jay Lockman wanted to do galactic H1, of course, but without those pesky side lobes. So he was for an unblocked aperture. Myself, I was determined to do something new. We just couldn't do something ordinary. It was an opportunity to find the state of the art, you know, and get some attention. So J1, it's a unblocked aperture that works at all frequencies. It's a real challenge. And we were keen to do it. Then the NSF threw a monkey wrench in the works. It was called LIGO, the Laser Interferometer Gravity Observatory. They had two interferometers. One was in Hanford up in Washington, and they were looking for a site for the other. They'd looked in Maine, Louisiana. Green Bank is a great idea, thought Eric Bloch. You know, that would get the senator behind it. Funding would be assured. And so he proposed this to Senator Byrd in a meeting with a a very hard sell, I must say. I mean, it was opined that there would be Nobel Prizes for West Virginians. Now, he was right about the Nobel Prizes, but of course the thing went elsewhere, so no West Virginians were included. Bird didn't think he could decide between a telescope and this physics experiment. It wasn't in his area of expertise. So he commissioned a study paper. And this paper was very well written. A good person put it together and compared the science of a telescope with that of LIGO. But at the end, it had a paragraph where it stated that the telescope would be of the most economic benefit to West Virginia. Well, Bird might have been a fan of radio astronomy, but he's a bigger fan of economic benefit to West Virginia. So that settled it. We were excused from this meeting, George and I, so while the senator was going to tell Eric Block what the decision was, it all took place in the Appropriations Committee room, which is something that looks vaguely like our answer to the Sistine Chapel. It's got murals all over the place of, Lewis and Clark, etc. It's quite a place, but it has windows. And if you walked around outside, as you could at that time, you could see into the committee room, and tourists did that all the time. And George and I had noticed that. So George says, why don't we go outside and peek inside and watch what's going on? But it was raining. So I don't think we did that. George may have a better memory of all that. At any rate, the senator told Eric that it was going to be a telescope, and we were outside the committee room doors when he came storming out and brushed right past us and left, and so we knew what had happened. So it was on to build a telescope. And Lee King did a design concept. We went out for bids. We got 3 bids. 2 of them were double the lowest. So of course we took the lowest from RSI. And in the end, I think the telescope probably cost RSI as much or more than the high bids. To recoup some of their loss, RSI filed claims. They claimed we had a defective spec in the contract. And these claims were of order 30 million. They kept changing. They ratcheted up a bit. AUI engaged an attorney to defend this in these claims, Randy Squires, who turned out to be fantastic. And Randy said, let's offer $4 million to these people to go away, which we did. Randy thought that would be about the cost of going to arbitration. RSI's attorney claimed to be offended by the offer and said they were going to go to arbitration, which we did. So this turned out to be a big deal. There was an enormous amount of discovery, as it's known, and we had to produce all kinds of things for RSI and for our own attorney. Harvey List and Dave Hogg were a huge help in doing that. And then the proceedings began up in Reston near Dulles Airport in a hotel with a room set up something like a courtroom. And there were witnesses. The proceedings almost ground to a halt when the judge discovered that Jay Lockman had roomed with one of the trustees, or, well, I can't remember exactly how that went. Jay could illuminate us, but it was a conflict of interest, and on the judge's part, I think. Yeah, that's right. The judge had roomed with one of the AUI trustees in prep school or something like that. There were, you know, I had a go at being a witness. I don't think I was a very good witness. Lee King was superb. If you didn't ask Lee exactly the right question, he wouldn't answer. You know, he gave the shortest, most precise answers. He was fantastic. Bob Hall, who was the project manager, was initially the least credible witness because Bob would kind of ramble. But then the judge learned that Bob had fought under Patton in World War II. And the judge was a huge fan of World War II history and Patton. And so he came to think quite highly of Bob. In the end, RSI was awarded $6.6 million. We had filed counterclaims and got $2.6 million. So we owed RSI $4 million. The legal expenses came to about $5 million. I mean, the Xerox costing alone, just to make copies, was $100,000, if you can believe it. So where was this $9 million coming from? Well, the NSF had not prepared any sort of contingency plan to pay these expenses. And the director at the time is Rita Caldwell. Eric Block had left. And Rita was in a bit of a spat with Che Kim in the Senate, who was in charge of, or was on the Appropriations Committee in the Senate. And Kim was just delighted that she was in a bind over this $9 million. But in the end, we got NSF off the hook by suggesting that they move our fiscal year, which started in January, just move it to October. So we got our money 3 months earlier, and then we had a quarter's year budget extra, which covered the $4 plus $5 million rather nicely and had some left over, as it turned out. Kim was furious about this, but we decided NSF happy was better than Che Kim happy, so it happened. At the inauguration then, Byrd lectured Rita Caldwell about NSF and their lack of enthusiasm for a new telescope. Ricardo Giacconi, when he introduced Rita, neglected to praise the senator, and so Byrd claimed he couldn't pronounce Giacconi's name. That was quite amusing. He went on and on, of course, as he is wont to do, until the honor guard, which was a troop of Cub Scouts from the local elementary school, started making the timeout sign right in front of him. But I'm not sure Byrd knew what the timeout sign meant. The NASA administrator flew in his jet, and his appearance was remarkable in a way. I was with Byrd and Dan Golden in Byrd's office at the time that Byrd gave, or Golden gave, a NASA award to someone. And Byrd said, "I want you to come to the dedication of this telescope in Green Bank." And Golden said, "Oh, well, that's ground-based astronomy. You know, we do space. It wouldn't be appropriate." "Oh, yes, it would," said the senator. And he said, "Well, I have to go to Moscow that day to negotiate some stuff. You know, I'm tied up." And Byrd said, "If you don't show up," he said, "I'm going to issue a subpoena to force you to come." So he flew in his jet, the NASA jet, and gave a speech, a remarkable speech written by Harley Thronson. And it compared Byrd to Galileo. If you get a chance, you should read or view the dedication clip that's on the website for this celebration. It was an unforgettable experience for everybody that was there, I think. So over the years, of course, the instrumentation got completed. The antenna itself got bugs worked out. The azimuth track got repaired. Everything has been improved to yield just an incredibly capable instrument, one we celebrate today. And thinking back, you know, I was struck by the fact that NREO had and has a fantastic staff. I mean, the accomplishments are really remarkable. I think we can be tremendously proud of it. So I'm grateful to have been a part of it, as big a distraction as it was for 10 years, you know, while we were trying to complete the VLBA, get a VLA upgrade going, get the MMA funded. I mean, everything was going on at once, but still, this was a huge experience, and I'm glad to have been a part. So I look forward to the corrections to these remarks from the panel. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. I appreciate your remarks. That's fantastic. While we're collecting questions here, you know, Paul, I want to thank you for your leadership in getting that done. I was, you know, this was a 5-year project that went to 10 years, so it not only posed financial hardships for the contractor, but NREO as well. You guided us through that, and I'm glad you spoke to the shift in the 1/4 of the fiscal year, because that was a nifty trick to keep the cash flow. Dave Parker's asked a question that I was going to ask myself, and it's getting seconded by a number of people. And maybe you can answer this, or maybe it's a question for George, but there's a folklore story about how we arrived at $75 million for the cost of the telescope. And the folklore is that the center was thinking in units of millions of dollars, and the astronomers were thinking in units of meters of diameter. So the lore is we thought we wanted a 75-meter diameter telescope, and what Bird heard was we wanted $75 million.
That's not right.
Can you confirm or deny that rumor?
Yeah, that's not right. What happened was we claimed we could do it for 55 million. And Eric Block asked if that included the design work and the development of the instrumentation. And, you know, thinking quickly, we said no. So he said, okay, I think it should be 65 million. And then Bird said, we'll make it 75. George, you remember that?
Yes. Let me see. Am I being heard, or?
You are being heard.
Okay. Well, here's my recollection, Paul. You and I were sitting there, and in the room in this that you described so well, my description is that would have been, if Hitler had won, that would have been where he set up headquarters. I mean, that room that we were in was so grand for the Appropriations Committee. But I thought we had asked for $50 million for a 70-meter telescope. I mean, it's like the first meeting we're in, and well, what are you guys going to do? Oh, well, we're going to need this, and at some subsequent meeting, Bird said, so you need 70 million. I didn't get the 75. You need $70 million for a 50-meter telescope. So we said yes, not the 50 meters, but the 70 million. And I've always wondered whether it was a mistake, Bird getting the numbers jumbled, or he thought, I don't want some piddly little telescope, $50 million thing, let's do it right. So that was my recollection of how we just sort of cashed in, I guess, through good fortune.
Well, you're probably right. I mean, it takes multiple memories to get the story straight.
Thanks, Paul. I've got another question here about funding the visitor center, but I'm going to hold off on that for the dedication panel discussion. You can talk about that there. But are there any other questions from the audience or the panelists before I open this up to panel discussion?
Mark?
Yeah.
This is Bill Porter.
Yep.
This is not a question, it's actually just a comment. Paul talked a little about the claims exercise that we all went through. And that was years of work, I think, in the end. And I just wanted to commend him on that. Paul's leadership in that, I think, was remarkable. And in particular, we were still years from completing the construction of the telescope. And the guys who were building the thing did not need to be distracted by a whole bunch of legal wrestling. And so Dr. Vanden appointed Heshen and Schwab and Hogg to basically be the claims team. And they went through all of the discovery. They prepared NRAO's case, or AUI's case, I guess. And those of us on the ground building the thing were freed up or not encumbered by that effort. And I have always thought that was a brilliant way to manage that. And since Dr. Vanden and I are both retired now, I don't think I can be accused of being obsequious, but I just want to make sure people understand what a great leader he was through that.
Well, thank you, Bill. We were saved by Randy Squires. You know, Randy was just a terrific attorney. And I think we were so lucky to get this guy, and he saved us on the track warranty claim too. He did a really superb job. When we started the proceedings, I wondered how this was going to go, and I'd never seen Randy in court, and he's very low key, and the other attorney was quite aggressive. And of course, we learned to hate RSI's attorney, but Randy explained that you always hate the opposition's attorney and you think yours is the best. But in fact, that's the way it turned out. I mean, he was really good. And then there were other people involved that helped, of course, get all this stuff together. And they, I can't remember everybody that had something to do with it, but Heshen, Hogg, Harvey turned out to be something of an amateur attorney. I thought he should have gone into the law. And he would find things and bring them to Randy's attention. So Harvey was a huge help.
Yeah, Bill, thanks for that. I concur with your sentiment. And my memory of that time was, this was when everything was kept in file cabinets. And for those of us in Green Bank, yes, there were manila folders, and then there were red folders, and the red folders were all the legal things. And so you couldn't dispose or share that because that was court evidence, and everyone's file cabinet had red folders in it. A couple other questions have come up. Someone has asked, can we go through the changes of contractor over the construction of the telescope? I'll take a quick stab at that, but let others weigh in. It was Radiation Systems Incorporated initially. They were bought out by ComSat. And then in the final days, it was Lockheed Martin who was the contractor. And that was the 30,000 foot view. Bill or Paul, did I miss anything there?
No, not at all. Dick Thomas owned RSI. Well known to NRAO. He had, in fact, built the 300 foot in the early days and filed claims on that one. Claimed he'd spent too much money, and he was a fledgling company, and his kids had to go to college. He went on and on and on to Ted Reif, and Ted just listened to him very quietly. And when he was all done with his plea for more money, Ted just said, bullshit. And that was the end of that. Yeah, he sold RSI to ComSat at a barbecue in his backyard. And the head of ComSat did no due diligence. He had no idea what he was getting into. Of course, ComSat was a huge outfit. So, 30 million bucks to them is coffee change. But nevertheless, they put up a fight over it. By the time it got to Lockheed Martin, nobody there ever remembered the GBT. So when Randy filed a warranty claim, they had trouble finding it. I mean, it was quite a search to find that contract and that warranty that they had made, but they stood up to it. And the great thing about RSI is all the time this was going on, they never stopped work. They finished the telescope, even though they were losing money like crazy. So Dick Thomas, you know, was a pretty solid guy to keep that going.
Dick was one of my favorite characters on the project, and I can't say I know this is absolutely true, but I somehow sort of suspect in all of the transactions of selling the original RSI through these large stock held companies, they managed to wash out their losses pretty well. So I don't feel too badly for them.
Not for Dick.
So I'm getting a lot of positive feedback on these stories. We're going to keep sharing some others that are popping up. Another side story was the Navy Clock Control Building, what is the new wing of the Jansky Lab. And for those who may not know that story, this was going to be a laboratory at Green Bank for timekeeping with multiple masers and cesium clocks and whatnot. And that was the provenance of that building. But nary a clock showed up apart from the maser we used for the GBT, because it was considered a pork barrel project on the part of the senator, and the clocks all disappeared. That's my recollection. Does Paul or Bill, anything else you want to share about that story?
Well, yeah, I mean, and George knows this too. It's just a wonderful story. The Naval Observatory wanted to place their timekeeping service in a secure spot in case Washington got hit by a nuclear bomb. So, you know, it'd wipe out the government, but we'd still know what time it was. And and so Green Bank was suggested, and the senator thought this was a terrific idea. So we're going to build this building. And he asked in our the Naval Observatory, USNO, how much it would cost. And I can't remember, but I'll just make up a number and say that was going to be $3 million. And then he asked George how much it was going to cost. And George knew the same figure and said $3 million, but the senator added them together. And so something like 6 was appropriated. Then, you know, the media found out about it and talked about this clock. It was a tick-tock that was going to go into this hamlet in West Virginia. And Byrd couldn't take the heat. So the clock disappeared, but the money did not. And the Navy, of course, was completely capable of spending twice as much money on the building, which they did. So we had the building and no clock in our way, and the Navy kept a lot of people employed. It was a win-win all the way around. That's how, now, George, you may have a different recollection. So
I didn't remember all that. I remember being with Gart Westerhout, who was uncomfortable, but I, of course, was pushing this whole idea, you should do this, so the senator. and he wanted to, and he did it, and then things changed. I'd also remember, though, we used some money to get, I don't know what you call them, though, Rich Lacasse will know, those quiet rooms where you can turn electronics on. It's got all those spongy things on the walls. That was funded by the Navy, too. Whether they knew it or not, or I think they knew it, but that was a generous contribution from the Naval Observatory.
The 20-meter telescope at Green Bank was paid for by the Navy.
Yes. And now it's mine.
The anechoic chamber, if I could break in for a moment, it was the anechoic chamber that George was talking about. I could maybe fill in a little background. The Naval Observatory had a backup master clock at their station in Florida, which was on the grounds of the Homestead Air Force Base in South Florida. And there was a big hurricane in '89 that damaged that a great deal. So the idea of building a backup master clock in Green Bank as a substitute for the one in Florida was, I think, part of where that idea of the backup master clock came from. But there was a senator in Florida who realized that if that station in Florida closed, it would mean a loss of maybe 5 jobs or something. So he raised a stink, and the Naval Observatory said, yeah, no, we don't need a backup master clock. So that idea disappeared as far as Green Bank was concerned.
Thanks, Frank. Hey, Phil, did you have a point you wanted to make?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. I was going to add just a tidbit following up on Paul's comment about Randy Squire. So Randy still works for us. And about a year ago, he gave me a call and said, hey, I still have all this discovery material from the Green Bank arbitration. That's actually at my old legal firm. Randy's at a new place now. And he says, do you want any of it? And I said, how much of it? And he said, it's approximately a room full. And my former colleagues really want to get rid of it. So I went to talk to Ellen Boughton, our archivist, and she said, actually, we've got it all, and we don't need it. So I talked to Randy, and he sent me some discs of it, but all of that material I think went to recycle eventually, but it survived for close to 20 years before it went. But I can second that Randy is completely unflappable, because in the follow-on saga of the settlement of the track issue, when we went to negotiate that, we discovered that the opposing attorney was the former prosecutor who had gotten a conviction of one of the 9/11 terrorists. And we walked in, and Randy recognized him from TV, but he said, nah, don't worry. And it all worked out fine, and completely unflappable.
Thanks, Phil. We're kind of segued into our panel discussion and with George's comments, but Jay had a question about the GBT design.
Yeah, one thing that always amazed me about that project, of which there were many amazing things, was that the proposal in June 1989 showed a symmetric antenna with the note that the offset would be discussed, considered. And then there was a committee that, from my point of view, was very hush-hush, that just disappeared behind closed doors. And by September, we had the GBT design as it now is.
We had to throw the proposal together kind of overnight, as I recall. And it whizzed through the NSF because it was approved by the NSF like 48 hours before the appropriation, the extreme, whatever it is, emergency supplemental bill was signed by the president. So I guess we hadn't gelled around the final design when we sent the proposal in and put that thing on the cover, kind of keeping our options open. But I'm just speculating on what happened.
Well, there was a committee that met that summer, and I'm not even sure I know who was on that, except I guess Phil Kronberg later told me he was, and maybe Joe Taylor, and they were the ones, I'm told, to make the choice. How did that happen? I'm just wondering how that happened.
I don't remember it. Yeah.
This is Larry. There may have been an external committee of astronomers that weighed in on this. There was also an internal technical committee that I was involved in, and it was a terribly difficult choice. We didn't know enough about how to make that choice. And I think referring back to Paul's remark early in his talk, it was important to do something innovative. And I think that consideration won the day.
Thank you, Larry. Sticking now with reflections on the beginning, George, are there any particular remembrances you'd like to share?
Well, sure. Watch out. Paul did a great job, and that's my recollection as well, but I'll add a little color. Two things. First, of course, it's stunning when you get a call in the middle of the night. I think it was between 11 and midnight that the telescope's down, and I assumed that meant something was wrong with the electronics, or, you know, all these things that can go wrong. We'll fix it in the morning. No, this was from Fred Cruz. It's down. I mean, and so I went, and boy, it was a tangled mass with a beam poking through the roof, the ceiling and the roof of the 300-foot control building where one telescope operator was, and he was not injured. So the best news immediately was nobody's hurt. The second, so that was the most important thing to know. All right. The second most important thing is, well, this isn't something you're going to repair. So being odd or something, I thought, well, the hell with that, it's over. I'm not going to gnash my teeth about we should have done this, we should have done that, because Fred Cruz and that team took excellent care of that telescope for all those years. So I didn't feel I didn't know, gee, if only we had done this or only done that. I just thought, let's move on, because that's history and there's no chance of making it any better. The response, then there's some underground in West Virginia, because I got a call between 5 and 6 in the morning. It was a news thing. They wanted to know about the telescope collapse. And what I want to know is, how did you know it collapsed? I mean, it was in the middle of the night, and word spreads fast. And then there was a deluge, Paul mentioned, there's a deluge of requests, including from Japan. And I was stunned. A helicopter flew from Washington, D.C. to get television pictures and so on. And that went on for a few days. And then, like everything else, it died out. I guess it probably died when that article came out that it was really enemy aliens or something that collapsed, that shot the telescope down in that rag of a newspaper. But anyway, that was the part. The only things I'll add to the meetings with Senators Rockefeller and Byrd, the response was rapid. It happened that when the telescope collapsed, Senator Rockefeller was at his home in Greenbank, essentially, and not the day it collapsed in the middle of the night. He didn't come that next following day, but he came the day after that with his son. And so you thought, well, there's a lot of interest in this. And he toured the telescope. Actually, all three of us walked underneath it and looked around, only to learn later that you're not supposed to do that because it might collapse on top of everybody. It didn't. So I quit walking under it, though. I remember that. But then the meeting that Senator Byrd called was immediate. Poor Eric Bloch, who I thought was an arrogant jerk and who misplayed his hand badly. Nevertheless, he was director of NSF. He learned a lot of lessons in this, I think. He had arrived from Antarctica, at where he'd been visiting because NSF's investment in the Antarctic, and he came back and he was to be in the office that day with Senators Byrd and Rockefeller. And he was. And the first question Byrd asked was, well, you know, with their little introductory comments, and then what are your plans now to replace the telescope? Well, we don't plan to do that, was the answer. Well, Byrd erupted. I was stunned, actually. He was red-faced, he stood up and he was shot. I actually thought he might hit Bloch, which would have been an interesting story in itself, but he didn't. The thing that saved the day was Senator Rockefeller, who gave a sort of civics lesson to Eric Bloch, saying, do you understand that every penny the US government spends passes through the committee that Senator Byrd chairs? Because Byrd had moved from majority or Senate majority leader to chairman of appropriations. Well, that did sort of sink in on Block that, you know, if NSF wants a budget, this is the guy who has huge control over what that budget will be. But I recall, Paul, that we were there a couple hours the first time. And finally, Block said, I think I can work with you, or words to that effect. And that's when Senator Byrd said, that's what I wanted to hear. So the meeting sort of broke up after that. That's my recollection.
You know,
the other thing, yeah, go ahead, Paul.
I was going to say that's right on. You know, that's how I remember it.
Yeah, it was stunning. It was stunning, wasn't it? The two of us sitting there thinking, "Oh my God, what's happening?"
Yeah, I don't think either of us had ever seen such a raw display of power.
No, I know. I agree. And how the games played at the highest levels, it was an eye opener. The only other thing I'll say that this is interesting. It irritated, everything that was happening was irritating Block enormously, who couldn't hide it. And I thought, you're playing your cards very poorly, but let's see how he was playing them. Nevertheless, what happens is there are always aides who have to do all the work, and they're sort of in the background. There's sort of this table, this enormous table, a few guys sitting around it, all these pictures and historical things on the wall. So you're sort of gazing around, but trying to pay attention. But there's always aides, and they're kind of invisible in the backdrop. And this was the beauty, because at some stage when the negotiations with, I don't know if they're negotiations, between Byrd and Block were going to settle some things, would we leave the room? So we would leave. Paul and I would get kicked out, and we'd sit outside waiting to see what happened. Well, there was an aide named Terry Sylvain, and later there was another one, Carol Mitchell, and they would fully inform us what happened and tell us, you screwed up when you said this, or you should have done this, or you should have done that. So we had sort of an insider's view as best they could recollect of what happened. And that turned out to be very valuable for us, at least for me, and I suspect for you too, Paul. They were very great. And of course, they do all the actual implementation. After these guys figure out, let's do this and let's do that. Okay, we agree. Okay, take care of it, you guys. Those are just details now. I always thought that was interesting. But we had a great relationship, especially I'd say with Terry Sylvain, who was on our side and trying to help and trying to let us know how to behave and what to do and what to say and what we had said. But I don't want to drag on, but I had just a couple things that I had noted. Well, that was the role of the aides. The Ligo complication was a tremendous complication because, as I recall, what are we going to say? That the first, it's funny, Paul, that they said, oh, there'll be a Nobel Prize. And we thought, oh, yeah. Then nobody even knew if Ligo could possibly, conceivably work, to tell you the truth. And there's a lot of physicists that said, no, and it's a waste of money and so on. That was not our battle. But it was Caltech, and they wanted to build this. And so we're in the room, and sort of Byrd wonders which would be better. And we are, what do you think of Ligo? And we didn't want to, what are you going to do? Attack Caltech and attack this idea when you hardly know what it is, although it seemed inconceivable that it could ever work to me. But there it was. Well, the word we got back from Terry Sylvain is, you guys blew it, because Senator Byrd is not a physicist, not a scientist, and he can't decide if LIGO is more valuable than a greenback telescope. He wants to help, and he got sold, oh, this would be so wonderful for West Virginia, LIGO would be. They sent someone out to look at putting it in Greenbank. But it put Byrd in the bad spot of, I'm trying to decide which is better, and I'm not a scientist, and how do I know? And the wimps at NRAO just said, oh, gee, that's a kind of interesting idea, but ours is better. Well, that doesn't work well. You got to sort of push harder. But it all fell apart. I don't think LIGO wanted to build it in West Virginia. And Byrd, I think, made some deal down there. However it happened, the politics, we got out of that. But I remember that was dramatic too. And I already told that story about getting mixed up between 70 meters and $50 million, or $70 million. And we got this, well, yeah, we heard 70 million after that. And Paul was very good about the main thing to remember is why, okay, this is magic. This just happened. I mean, it's a disaster followed by, you know, a miracle. Don't just say, well, why don't we build everything that's always been done before? You know, why don't we just imitate something else, some standard design? I give Paul a lot of credit because that would have blown the whole miracle that happened at that time. That go big. I mean, you just hit the jackpot for whatever reason. Take advantage of it and do something that's never been done. And I'm glad to see that's exactly that. It was the plan, and now it has happened, and all that good stuff that's coming out of the telescope is wonderful. So it ends up a happy story after a disaster. And I'll step aside here.
Now, thank you very much, George. Oh, go ahead, Paul.
I was just going to say on the LIGO thing, after it was decided to build a telescope, Bird wasn't satisfied. He said, why don't we have LIGO 2?
Yeah.
Okay, so we were required to write a proposal for Green Bank, you know, a proposal to LIGO to consider Green Bank as a site. And George is right. Robbie Bout wasn't that keen on Green Bank. It would require a lot of tunneling and bridges and stuff. And he was not that enthused about it. And I guess we weren't either. So George, I believe you did this. In the proposal, there was a kind of poison condition, which was that if the LIGO instrumentation caused any RFI whatsoever for the GBT, they would have to close operations.
Yeah, that was
their excuse then for not going to Green Bank.
Yeah.
All right, thanks, George. Thanks, Paul. I think I can predict that Terry Sylvain's name is going to come up later in our discussion.
Yes.
It's also funny how some things never change. The LIGO folks have approached us about combining sites with NGVLA. So one thing, so I want to sort of shift gears a little bit and ask the panel on how the GBT got its name, because some of us know about the NL SRT memo series. Our Tucson colleagues wanted to call it the LSD, large single dish is what that means. Jay, I believe, wanted to call it the BFD, and pause, that stands for big floppy dish. And so how did we end up with GBT? Jay will answer it.
Yeah, this big floppy dish thing is a base canard. What happened was that at the 25th anniversary of the 300-foot telescope, Rick Fisher and I were standing underneath it with wine glasses in our hands. And we got to thinking, they built this very quickly and very cheaply. What did they know, the designers of the 300-foot, that we did not know now? And so I wrote a memo for the NLSRT memo series, suggesting that the need for stiffness might be overrated and that what we might want is a big floppy dish. Okay, later in November, the whole concept of what they knew that we don't know got blown up when the 300-foot collapsed, and there was never any suggestion that it be floppy after that. But that was the temporary thing to try to get the discussion of a new dish underway months before the 300-foot fell.
Thank you, Jay. And I've got a side note here from Mark Reed where Bernie Burke lobbied to have an LSD in the decadal survey for the field committee. And it didn't do very well, but it sort of plowed important ground for the GBT scientifically. And Mark, I hope I captured your point satisfactorily there. Anyone else on the panel want to opine on reflection at the beginning? Ken, you've been quiet.
Well, I think George and Paul pretty well covered it all. But if you want to hear more of the gory details, chapter 9 of our book describes everything in great detail. The only other thing I was going to comment on, George, my memory is, maybe I don't have this right, but you neglected to mention that prior to all this, prior to the 300-foot collapse, you were actually advocating to have Ligo come to Greenbank. Is that right?
No, that isn't right. It's awkward, Ken. I was at Caltech and Robbie Bout, and I was just say we had our interactions. I was never, when he showed up, I thought, I'm going to stay. He came to Greenbank because he was asked to by NSF, and he visited. And I thought, I stayed as far away as I could, so there'd be no. No, I wouldn't say I was. Hey, Robbie, why don't you build it in Greenbank? He would. If I had said that, it'd be the last place he'd want to go, because somehow we ended up contentious once in a while. Yeah.
Okay.
All right. Thanks, Ken. Again, we're a little behind schedule, so I'm going to propose we move to our next speaker. I'm assuming Mark's ready, but I did have an introduction I wanted to have for Mark. I have very fond memories working with Mark in Greenbank. I was a support scientist at the telescope. For those who don't know Mark, he's a software engineer heavily involved in monitor control software. In particular, what was the pulsar backend at the 140 foot at the time, the spectral processor. It had been recently moved there and it was a little bit cantankerous. And so what's always been great about Greenbank is when something breaks, the staff responds. And so I would be observing or supporting the observations of some of the colleagues I see here, Dan Steinbring, David Nice. And invariably at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, the machine would fail, and which meant I had to call out Mark. And my most vivid memory of Mark was he would enter the building to great fanfare saying, "I'm not here to fix the problem, I'm here to fix the blame." And that was always great because it kind of broke the ice. It was always tense, but when Mark arrived, things kind of calmed down. So with that, here he is to fix the blame, Mark Clark.
Hi, everyone. Mark shared a recording of his presentation in advance. So unless he wants to change that opportunity right now, I have that ready to play. I'll pause a moment to see if Mark does want to jump in beforehand, but otherwise I will roll the recording that he shared.
Hello. I want to thank the Observatory for inviting me back to Greenbank, if only virtually, to take part in the per diem free 20th anniversary. My wife and I spent 28 years in Greenbank, raised our 3 daughters there, and it's always been a special place for us. And I have to say, after being gone for almost a decade, we haven't hit a deer yet. Usually the most notable characteristic of someone visiting GBT, including the astronomers, is its gigantic size. But for a lot of us who worked on it, it's the flexibility or dynamic nature that we remember. It is usual to refer to a telescope as an instrument, but for the GBT, I believe laboratory is a better word. In 2006, a number of us got to go to Glasgow for a conference on astronomical instrumentation. The keynote speaker, who I think it was the Astronomer Royal, gave this great pep talk. He began by asking what kind of instrumentation would aliens in our galaxy need to determine if our planet had life. He argued that we will have such instrumentation in the near future, given the advances already achieved. And then he gave credit to the attendees for making it possible, and that this was the best time in history to be an astronomer. It was pretty heady stuff. Afterwards, everyone was ready to leave the locker room and run out in the field. Looking back at the building and outfitting of GBT and all the new computer technology that was becoming available, it was also the best time to design and build a control system for what we knew was going to be quite the telescope. If you look at the timeline of the digital revolution alongside the GBT construction and outfitting, you see it was a fortuitous alignment. Now, I was originally hired in 1985 to work on a new control system for the 300-foot telescope. The project had already decided to write the system in the C programming language on a mini computer, which at that time was a bit unorthodox. And unfortunately, before the work was completed, the 300-foot collapsed in 1988, only a year after its 25th anniversary, which I probably shouldn't mention here. In those years, software had, to say the least, an uneasy relationship with telescope observers. The role of computers was primarily to provide real-time control of the antenna and other active devices, and the configuration of equipment was predominantly manual. The design and implementation of telescope software was chiefly handled by self-taught programmers who had backgrounds in astronomy. And considering the state of hardware and software technology at that time, the accomplishments of these systems were awesome, with people like Barry Clark, R. Bob Vance, and Johann Schrammel regularly managing to squeeze blood from turnips. With these successes and their interaction among multiple computers still in the future, it's little wonder that a software model using real-time loops to continuously keep instruments in sync during a scan became the acknowledged approach in the observatory. There was a conjunction of two events that changed our thinking concerning the role of computers for the new telescope. First, the exploding availability of new software and digital technology. And secondly, the aggressive design of the GBT. My first portent came during an astronomers gathering in Greenbank just weeks after the loss of the 300-foot telescope to determine a replacement. Now, as a non-astronomer, I found these discussions spirited, exciting, and a lot of fun. The participants seemed to break into incompatible factions: big floppy versus small rigid disk, safe versus clear aperture, in Greenbank and anywhere but Greenbank. One proposal I remember clearly, coming, I believe, from the plains of New Mexico, was to build a smallish interferometer in Deer Creek Valley. I was sitting near Rick Fisher, which I tried to do whenever astronomers start speaking in tongues. He explained that the argument always takes place for new telescopes and is determined by whether resolution or flexibility is seen as the primary goal. Now, as a single-dish telescope, the GBT would, of course, require flexibility in the software. However, the final design of the GBT included a large, high-precision collecting area, providing a wide frequency range, multiple receivers on demand, as well as the ability to handle a variety of instrumentation, such as back-ends. All this made it clear that the monitor control system for the telescope needed to be far more than just flexible. It had to be dynamic enough to realize all the capabilities of the GBT. And at this time, I also had the feeling that we were given leeway to experiment and try new ideas. Recently, I watched a unreleased PBS documentary, and John Payne said as much. He said they were attempting a non-traditional approach towards pointing, and added, with no apologies, it may not work. This mindset gave our work a feeling of adventure. So how does one design a monitor and control software for a Swiss Army knife telescope? Objectives of software design are to reduce the probability of bugs, to provide for maintainability, and to allow efficient implementation. A classic strategy for this is to turn big programming problems into smaller independent problems, divide and conquer. To compartmentalize the control of many possible instruments used in observing, we needed the software for each instrument to run independently during a scan. This greatly eases the task to include or exclude an instrument in a specific scan or to integrate a new instrument, even temporarily, into the telescope. Now, how to achieve this? Well, we adopted the dirty dozen architecture. A quick reminder. To accomplish their mission, the convicts were given their individual tasks beforehand. Then later, they negotiated with Lee Marvin as the time to initiate the attack, synchronize their watches, and independently attack the chateau. Any intelligence gathered by the team was time-stamped to be later collated for post-mission analysis. However, unlike the movie, we prefer that at the end of the scan, all the members of the operation, be they convicts or instruments, survive. Some instruments on the telescope only had to be configured prior to the scan. Other instruments were more challenging. Foremost was the antenna itself. Like John Payne, I was not sure that this architecture could be implemented to pre-specify the antenna to move its beam in any pattern on the sky at a given start time. There's a cartoon that comes to mind. It shows a board of directors meeting, and the CEO has a poster displaying a big arrow going from a dollar sign to a portrait of himself. The text reads, "Here's the big picture, go work out the details." Well, the Dirty Dozen architecture was the big picture. Others usually worked out the details. Then comes the quagmire of user interfaces. The telescope software sits between the interfaces to the hardware and to humans. The architecture described previously dealt with hardware. For that, the instrumentation is what it is. But user interfaces have a person on the other side. More difficult to define, more volatile, more unpredictable, more innovative, and especially for a telescope having a wide range of dynamic capabilities. We did not want the observer's window into the system to hinder access to any of its possible uses, known or unknown. Also, learning to observe should not be a career in itself. In addition, the observer's interface is where the mistrust of software and the programmers was most volatile. When astronomers spoke of telescope software, it was obvious they were thinking primarily of their own interface to the telescope, not the configuration, coordination, monitoring, control, error report, and data collection, and all the other required functions needed for a scan. Their suggestions were not from a tabula rasa. The observers were experienced working with many telescopes worldwide, and they had their favorites. Everyone had opinions on the right mode and look for observers. For example, one astronomer wanted an image of a computer card on the monitor screen, where he could then enter the same information that he had previously fed into the card reader. Our earliest efforts were towards implementing a graphical user interface, perfectly referred to as a GUI. I can honestly say, for an observer's interface, it was pretty much a failure. Those types of programs were huge resource sinks. Besides, it was too static. We needed something more dynamic. So just as distributed computing and object-oriented software provided paths towards solutions for monitoring and control, the advent of scripting languages was a godsend for solving the observer interface. A general-purpose scripting language would eventually provide the platform needed to build the observer's interface for the GBT. Now, an important characteristic of scripting languages is the ability to expand their functionality, essentially allowing one to create an application-specific language. Our use of Python was pivotal. Using Python to implement a foundation architecture that mapped the monitor and control parameters into observing concepts opened the door for staff astronomers to create an array of features for the observers. Observers could approach their own observing at multiple levels. Observe interactively, write scripts, use previously defined observing modes, or even access directly monitor control parameters, all with Python, which has since become the most popular scripting language within astronomy. Now, here Amy corrected me. It is the most popular scripting language, period, and only second to C in all languages. Monty would be proud. For me, reading the current observer's guide for the GBT was very rewarding. It has certainly come of age. At the meetings where the astronomers were wrestling with the question of what should replace the 300 foot, I remember an argument being made against any high-frequency telescopes to be built in Green Bank because of the climate. After all, this isn't Kitt Peak. Ken Kellermann provided numbers on opacity and frequency, but for me, what was most notable was his summary. High-frequency observing is not often good in Green Bank, but when it is good, it is very, very good. Looking back, this statement seemed to trigger a series of decisions, each making the telescope more dynamic and more challenging to software development. The string of decisions appeared to be, so high-frequency observing in Green Bank would indeed be valuable along with low frequency. So a large dish with high-frequency capabilities. So new technical solutions for an active surface and improved pointing. However, we wanted to retain hands-on observing by astronomers. So scheduling by observer availability to come to Green Bank was not compatible with scheduling telescope time for optimal weather. So all of this required remote observing, with observer notification short enough to make weather forecasts useful. Traditionally in Green Bank, hands-on observing implied interactive observing. The problems to be solved for dynamic scheduling included quantifying the factors that determine observing efficiency, their integration into a single value for a specific time, the combining of these values over time to create an observing schedule that makes best use of the telescope, and allowing the factors used in creating a schedule to be transparent to the observers, that is, show them the process is objective. Astronomers can be quite possessive when it comes to telescope time, as anyone who's had to fix bugs during observation knows. Of course, the new technology that made its timely entrance and allowed us to realistically consider remote interactive observing was the internet, and in turn made dynamic scheduling feasible, a happy result. Except now, the notice that someone's in the batter's box was only days long, not weeks or months. Some observers were not exactly enchanted by this turn of events. But the pieces fell together beautifully. Jim Condon and Dana Balser developed a mathematical definition for observing rank, based on observing efficiency, performance limits, stringency, Q pressure, and other factors. The knapsack problem and its solutions provided the means to compute an optimal schedule. It was gratifying to see all the effort personnel expended in creating a dynamic telescope come together in a dynamic scheduling system that could demonstrate concretely, or at least on a t-shirt, how well the GBT could take advantage of all the options it had to offer to observers. In conclusion, when I completed graduate school for computer science in 1980, little did I know hardware and software technology was on the edge of a tsunami of changes. Almost all I was taught in graduate school was passé in just a few years. As beautiful as the 300-foot was, given the tools that were soon to be available, I think they picked an opportune time to bow out. As we worked on the GPT hardware and software systems, we strove to select the appropriate tools from the short conveyor belt from evolving technology that ran from cutting edge to obsolete. This was even more fun since the deadline was always 2 years in the future during its entire 9-year construction. In telling this story, there's been no time to acknowledge the many individuals who made the system possible. However, I will mention how well the team worked together. I have never experienced a better group of talented, generous colleagues who took better advantage of shared genius. As some of you know, our camaraderie bordered on rowdiness. Thank you.
Yay! Good job, Mark.
Thank you very much, Mark. Hey, Mark, any parting words before we shift gears to dedication? Okay. Thanks again, Mark. It's been great to see you again. It's been a long time. Okay, with that, we'll go to dedication, and Phil wanted to share some slides with us.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. Let me do that. So I thought it might be a little fun to take a walk back and show you a few things from my recollection. I was privileged to be the site director at the time of the dedication, but along with the support of the fantastic team that you are hearing about, I'd like to start with what happened before the dedication. At the time of the dedication, we had what looked like a polished and finished dish that was working really smoothly. But I'd like for you to see what it looked like just about a year or two before that. So, and by the way, we had sort of a poor man's version of time-lapse photography. So Jay, my predecessor, had set up a camera on a tripod out of the window in his office. And when I came in January of '99, about where this first photograph, I kept up taking a picture every morning. And Ellen has all these photos down in the archive, and she kindly dug them out. But take a look in January of '99, which was only about 18 months or 19 months before the dedication. The dish is sitting there, no feed arm, no surface on it. By July of '99, just about a year before, the feed arm is sort of halfway up, still no surface on it. Then in January of 2000, feed arm is up and the surface is halfway on. And in July of 2000, just a month before the dedication, it's finally all the way built, but look that there's still cranes all the way around. And by the time of August, a month later, everything is just totally cleaned up. It looks like a telescope's been operating from years. It's spit polished, and you'd never know that this hadn't been operating for years. So there was a fantastic effort, and it happened in a short amount of time. So, you know, I think Paul will remember the circumstances better than I do, because it's all kind of came in a blur. But given the complicated history of the telescope there, and the fact that there were some other things on the agenda of the observatory, there was a fair bit of push and pressure to show victory at the earliest possible time. So, so we had set the date of the dedication, and but as you can see from that set of photos, it was tight right up to the beginning, right up into the time of the dedication. So we started to organize for the dedication, and here's the program that we had put together. And I still have all the documents for the dedication planning sitting on my computer disk. And every now and then, when I want to scare myself, I go back and look at these things. But this is from my Word file from the thing. And when we started to put together the dedication, you know, I think Mike Holstine and Mark and I were kind of working on it. And, you know, we thought, you know, we've done these kind of things before. This is not going to be a problem. You know, we'll invite a few speakers. We'll have some food, get some steaks, and there'll be some mason jars put out with some stuff that looks like water, but it's not water. And everybody will have a pretty good time. But we were very quickly disabused of the idea of that by the famous aforementioned Terry Sylvain, that there was a very well-developed recipe and a precise recipe that we were going to follow in putting this together. And if we didn't follow this recipe, the cake was not going to bake. So I'm going to say a little bit more about that in a second. But this is what it looked like. But there was a lot of advanced planning. So for example, we were going to hold a luncheon ahead of time. We had to get invitations out. You know, here's what the invitation, we had to work out this vast invitation list. Shirley Curry, who was our admin today, by the way, today is Admin's Day. For all of you who have admins, be sure and wish your admin good wishes for all the great job that they're doing. And Shirley was my admin at the time, and she got all these invitations out. And we worked out a list for the luncheon. And this was approximately of the same complexity as arranging for the Met Gala, because there's limited capacity, as everybody knows, in the Green Bank cafeteria, and trying to fit, we had 80 people that we could get in. And we had a lot of dignitaries coming to this. You can see the list there. And it was hard trying to figure out who was going to get to come in and sit. And you can see my name down at the very bottom. It was, I was not sure that I was going to get a seat or not. But the only reason that, and this was a big success and everybody had a good time. And the only reason that it came off successfully is because our dear cafeteria workers did, and they were under a lot of pressure. did a fantastic job. And I remember that luncheon was one of the big successes, and you can see the senator there obviously pleased with the service that he was getting. So everything was highly scripted. I had a script worked out for the whole thing. Here's the first page of it with the famous observation of the pulsar, which I want Mark to explain in a minute. But it came time for the ceremony. And I remember riding down in the bus and there, and we had the senator on board, and Paul was sitting beside me, and I must have looked a little pale because I remember Paul looking at me at one point and just saying, "Breathe," and I think I needed that at that point. But we kicked the thing off following the prescribed, very precise recipe from Terry. So we had the introduction, and before this, we had the white knuckle demo of the pulsar. And so Mark has really got to go through the description of the pulsar observation because it broke every rule of not doing a demo, sort of an untried demo in front of a big audience. But I think it was one of the big highlights of the whole thing. So we had the intro. We then had the colors from the National Guard and Roncevert. We had the playing of the national anthem from the Pocahontas High School band. We had the Pledge of Allegiance from the local Cub Scout troop. We had the intro of guests from the Unflappable Paul. And then we had the invocation from Father Ackerman, all part of the recipe. And that was all just the preliminaries. Then we had Dan Golden, NASA administrator. And so Paul has already talked about that, but there's more to the story of Dan and the NASA jet. And I want Mike Holstine to tell the story about what was involved and where Dan, Administrator Golden, and his pilot, where they wanted to come and where they ended up going. So that's a story for Mike to tell because he was involved in many conversations on that. So we had Dan. Then we had AUI President Giacconi, and then NSF Director Rita Caldwell, and finally keynote speaker Senator Byrd. And it was a stem winder, and it was a great speech. And then finally, at the end of the formal ceremonies, we had the ribbon cutting. And I want you to look at the scissors that were used at the ribbon cutting. Now, my recollection is that the Greenbank shop, Dennis will have to confirm this, but I think the Greenbank shop actually made those scissors. So that is a real set of gigantic scissors. But fortunately, there were no amputations recorded, but that was a serious set of scissors there. And last but not least, we had the Bing Brothers band during the reception. But this whole thing, it comes as something of a blur. I think it was a pretty big success, and boy, was it a team effort. There was a tremendous amount of work pulling the telescope together by the contractor, by the Greenbank staff, doing technical work in the time leading up to this, and of course in the time after it. And I just wanted to take the opportunity to once again extend my thanks to what everybody, to the tremendous effort that was put in. So I'm going to stop with what I wanted to say, Mark.
Thank you very much, Phil. And thanks for that introduction to the dedication ceremony. And as I recall, the RSI staff hated that camera because they thought we were spying on them with it. That was the sole purpose. One thing I wanted to concentrate on here, Phil, is you talked about the the activities and the agenda, but this was a huge planning and logistical effort. I mean, there were things like we chartered a bus from Washington, D.C. to bring NSF and Senator Byrd's staffers, big catered dinner and all sorts of other things. And maybe let me turn over to Mike Holstine, because Mike was the guy who made all that happen. So Mike, could you maybe chime in on some thoughts about that and maybe answer Phil's challenge there on the airplane story for Mr. Golden?
Well, sure. Yeah. Thanks, Mark. Great summary, Phil. You've got a heck of a memory. And yeah, I've got all of that information on my computer too. I'm gonna share a screen here real quick though. When you're talking about planning the dedication and you think back on those days, boy, there it is. Look at that. Kind of young looking, aren't we? Yeah. But it was a huge task. There's no question about that. And the thing about Dan Golden's jet is that he wanted to fly into West Virginia. I mean, you heard from Paul that he didn't want to do this. He had other places to go. And so he wanted to fly directly into West Virginia, but the Green Bank Airport just wouldn't accommodate what he was wanting to do. And so we ended up working out an arrangement for him in Lewisburg, and he could fly into the Lewisburg airport, and Daryl Shinneberry from our plant maintenance staff had to drive to Lewisburg to pick him up and bring him up to the site in the right amount of time so that he could do his speech, and then immediately returning to Lewisburg. So there were several people. Daryl was one, of course, but I can name right off Mark and Roger and Joe and Rich and Tim and others that actually missed the festivities that day because they were doing other things that made the program a success for everybody.
Hey, Mike, can I just add in? I mean, my recollection, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you actually had to do a little bit of convincing. That my recollection is that his pilot was fairly insistent for a while that he could land on the airstrip. And yeah, I think he was a former carrier pilot or something, and he was really certain that he could set it down and get it off. And the thing that finally convinced him that it was a bad idea is that he wanted to leave early. And we told him that if he did that, he would be taking off right in the middle of the senator's speech. Yeah. And that was the thing that actually was the tipping point that made him go to Lewisburg instead of roaring out of off of the Green Bank airstrip.
Yeah.
Let me add a little bit to that. This is Larry Daddario. As the biggest user of the Green Bank airstrip over the years, I've landed there in a small Piper at least 100 times. I can say that it is difficult to get into, even in a little airplane. I used to say that to drive from Charlottesville to Green Bank, the biggest thing you had to worry about was hitting a deer. And fly from Charlottesville to Green Bank, the biggest thing you had to worry about was hitting a deer on the runway. And it was my standard procedure to make a low pass over the runway at about 100 feet before coming around to land in order to scare the deer away. Anyway, nevertheless, it is true that over the years that I was there were a couple of times when NASA flew someone in a NASA aircraft. It was not a jet, however. It was a twin-engine prop plane. I can't remember the model, probably a King Air. But anyway, it is possible to land larger aircraft there, but most jets would would have a difficult time. It isn't so much the length of the runway, but the terrain around it, where you have to make a steep descent or steep climb out, or a sharp turn immediately after takeoff or before landing. Okay, that's it for me.
Phil, if I might add a couple of details to the discussion on the preparation and the meals and all of that. I can give you some statistics if you'd like to hear them.
Let's hear
them. So we did hire a caterer to come in because the cafeteria staff had a lot to do already. They used $200 in fuel. This is in 2000, just for the grill to prepare what food they did on site. They brought 500 pounds of ice with them. They served 325 pounds of ribs, 203 pounds of chicken, 40 pounds of chili for the hot dogs, 55 pounds of hot dogs, 165 pounds of baked beans, 40 pounds of slaw, 125 pounds of potato salad, 125 pounds of macaroni salad, 125 pounds of fruit salad, 180 dozen cookies, 48 pounds of potato chips, 40 pounds of party mix, 80 cases of sodas and bottled water, and 130 gallons of lemonade and tea.
That is huge.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. I was glad you shared that. That was I was hoping you'd speak to that because it was just a huge logistical event. I had another request for a camera story from Ron. Ron, you ready to share that?
Yep, let me unmute. So, so one year the summer students knew about this camera that was in the field taking daily photographs of the GBT. And so they wanted to leave something memorable in the archives. So one morning, 3 of them go out into the field in front of the camera. They don't know exactly when the photo is going to be taken, but they do know it's in the morning. It's a weekend. They drop their trousers in front of this camera. They stand there for 2 hours, holding in front of themselves the pieces of cardboard with the letters R-O-N on it, my name. And then they went home. They didn't know whether the picture was taken. So a few years ago, I got an email from Ellen Boughton, who had gone through all the photos, and she found this one photo of these students standing in front of this cameras with their pants dropped. And so it's just, our summer students every year do a prank, and it's just one of those pranks that they did that immediately had no consequences, but many years later, it's out there, it's in the archives. Pictures of summer students with their pants down, standing in front of the GBT.
Such an NRAO tradition, you know, that's awesome.
Thanks, Ron. So Ann, you've got the mic here. How about your remembrances of the dedication, and in particular, the bus ride to the site? For Sylvain again.
Yeah, you know, Mark, I didn't really remember that at all. I think I was a bundle of nerves myself, and you were the one that reminded me. You've got an excellent memory about the day. But my goal had been for several years, because of George as my first boss, to find some money and build a science center, build a better tour center. And I had been pursuing that goal at the state level with the blessing of Jay and Phil later, and Paul too. And they kept telling me to ask the feds, you know, why are you asking us in West Virginia? Go ask the feds. And of course, NSF didn't provide monies really for capital costs like that. And so really it was my bosses who started that process of thinking and getting the word to Senator Byrd, or in some way to appropriate some money to build a big new science center. But I had the opportunity during that day to sell the idea to Terry Sylvain, really, not really to Senator Byrd, but to Terry Sylvain, and it worked. And then later we said, you know, if we had a little bit more money, we could build a bunkhouse, and that would really help us do better science outreach because the kids would have somewhere to stay. and it just happened just like that. So I have Phil and Paul and to thank for that mostly, but apparently I had a conversation with Terry Sylvain. I think it started in the cafeteria before we got on the bus to go down. But it was a great day. And Mark, I hope you are going to tell the Pulsar story, because that's the thing I remember the most, is hearing that sound over the loudspeakers. And I'm sure that I started crying right then, because it was finally ready. The GBT was finally ready. We would not have to say 2 more years ever again on that day. Yeah. So that was what I remember so well.
Well, I'll take the bait there, Sue Ann, but I think you're being a little too humble. I mean, it was by design to have Sue Ann speak with Mr. Sylvain and the senator about our plans for a science education center. I think it was Jay who actually wrote the proposal for it. We had the idea, just didn't have the money. And lo and behold, a couple of years later, the money shows up for it. So it was a great thing. And George Molenbrook, I hope that answers your question on how that all came about. That was Sue Ann. Well, with a lot of help from the senator. The Pulsar story, I won't go into a lot of detail. There's a very nice, well, Amanda made a video with me sort of relaying the first light story. It all got tied up in acceptance of the telescope. RSI, or it was ComSat, Lockheed Martin at the time, wanted the telescope accepted and wouldn't let us really do what we wanted to do. Paul, rightly so, earlier that year said, Mark, we really need to show that this telescope works for the dedication ceremony. And as I noted in that video, I didn't think Paul was serious at the time, but he kept after me. I thought, the director is really serious about this, so I got to do it. So we built a new receiver for it. Well, I shouldn't say we, it was Roger Nord and Louis Beale. And we got to the point where we were negotiating the final acceptance. We were still kind of on edge. Are we really going to do this or not? We weren't too optimistic because their lawyer had gotten involved, and Paul said, well, hey, Mark, if we can't pull that off, doesn't Sue Ann have some tapes we could play, and we'll just pretend that we're observing a pulsar? And I thought, no, we need to do the real thing. So on August 22nd, we accepted the telescope, at least the terms, and we round up all the guys with a prime focus box handler. The prime focus receiver we built, it was the same kind of parts you used at the 300 foot or the 140 foot, and hauled the receiver up, and got it first try on the Pulsar 1133+16. And then we wanted to play that over a loudspeaker during the dedication ceremony. And some weird memory I have of this is, well, I have to go spend money to get the speaker wire between the GBT and the podium. And that was about 300, 400 meters. And I remember that spool of wire cost $400. And I just recoiled in horror. At $400, that's a lot for wire. But we wheeled it out there and it all worked great. There's a different pulsar observing to the north. And as I think Mike already mentioned, it was Joe Brandt, Rich Lacasse, and Tim Whedon at the controls. And Roger was there to make sure all the RF stuff worked properly. So we observed the pulsar through the entire ceremony, just turned off the loudspeaker system as the senator was speaking. And then on the end, the pulsar is nominally, it was circumpolar. I mean, it's always up. So we were pointing really high. So to show off, we brought the telescope down to as low elevation, pointed to the north as we could, then swung it around counterclockwise so that it swept across the audience. That's probably my most vivid memory of the celebration, because I was on the structure watching the crowd watch the telescope, and it's a big piece of steel. So that was, I got pretty emotional about that. Then as the telescope pointed due south, it ran into a limit switch that the logic was programmed incorrectly on. So the telescope stopped dead in its tracks, and no one else knew it. We're in the telescope. Oh my God, what are we going to do? We can't. we can't figure it out. And so we just said, Joe, just make it point straight up. We'll move it in elevation. And we pointed it straight up. So I think we nicely recovered from all that. It was a lot of fun, and the team really came together to make that all work. It was great. Anyway, let's see. Sophie's volunteered something here. I'm going to solicit from some questions from the audience. And Sophie, you had some trivia things you wanted to share with us. Can you do that now?
Yeah, absolutely, Mark. We've got a couple of questions here that we'll launch for our attendees. And we want to know how many great white sharks in preparation for the next session would you need to equal the mass of the Green Bank telescope, and about how much does the Green Bank telescope weigh? So attendees can put their answers in. We're seeing some votes coming in now. And just so you know, so we can be very accurate, we're taking the average mass of a great white shark. We're not going to the extreme limits here. And later during the pulsar session, we will have some trivia about which pulsar. So I saw Tony put in the chat which pulsar he thinks that first light observation was with, and we will show you then. We'll give you a couple more seconds and then show you all what you all think. Oh, that's okay if you give the answer. We'll have new people. All right, we'll give you 3, 2, 1. So the majority of you all got the second question close, but the answer actually is B. It's closer to 16,727,000 pounds versus that 17 million pound weight. And this is actually 9,000. If you guessed A, there's 21 of you. You are correct. 9,000 great white sharks would add up to about the GBT's weight. Thanks, Mark.
Thank you, Sophie. Any other questions coming in from the audience? I've not been giving you, any of you.
This is George Seielstad. Can I make a comment?
Yeah.
Phil, I looked at your dedication, the scorecard, whatever you want to call it, and it started with the invocation and it ended with, I don't know what you call the ending, but we had some sort of probably groundbreaking ceremony. And of course, Senator Byrd was there and was the featured person. And we had ridden down with he and probably some staff in one of the old diesels. And on the way back, he said, it was very nice. Oh, by the way, George, often when we have ceremonies, we have, an invocation. And so I had not arranged one. Phil, you were on top of everything and did what I'm sure pleased him, which leads me to one other story, and then I'll try to be quiet. I had several conversations privately with Senator Byrd. I don't know what made Paul mad, but anyway, I had several meetings with him. And sometimes for hours. It always astonished me. He had a great interest in astronomy. He had a son-in-law who was a physicist who actually was doing physics in the Middle East someplace. I remember him telling me that. So he liked to get some of these stories, and he was very interested in astronomy, but it would always lead him to a question like, I'm sure all astronomers must believe in God. And sitting in front of him was one astronomer who, I don't know, just, okay, fine, if so many astronomers believe in God. So my answer always was, and I got away with it because you could tell what he wanted me to say. I would always say, well, there are many astronomers and they all have different beliefs. Some believe in God, some don't, some do this. And I got away with it every time without compromising my own, wanting to please him because he could please me, but not sort of sell my soul. And I always found that intricate, and it worked.
Thank you, George. Let's see. Tony, you're online. You were heavily involved in the planning, particularly on the EPO front. Any comments you want to make about that part of the dedication effort?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I was heavily involved. I was just kind of over there to support you guys in the inauguration. I actually came over and lived in Greenbank for a month. I think Paul was sick of me, wanted to get me out of Charlottesville. I actually came over with Helen Sim. I don't know if people remember Helen. She was involved. I actually tried to invite her to this thing, but I think she's retired now, and so not really available. The thing I remember a lot of what you guys mentioned. I remember on the day one of the roles I had was to give Rita Colwell the tour around the telescope, and I was with someone, I don't remember who it was, and I just remember she was really not very happy. She was walking her around that day. She was not having a good day, and yeah, years later I gave another NSF director a tour, and she was also not happy. So I don't know what it means, but Rita on the day, I guess Paul's maybe explained why she was not so happy. So I remember, you know, the pulsar, that was great and amazing. One memory I have is that I guess the same summer students that weren't wearing pants planted a flag at the top of the telescope or something like that. Right up at the very top, there was like a skull and crossbones telescope on top of the telescope. Maybe it was not the day of the inauguration or a couple of days beforehand, but I remember talking to you about it, Mark, and you were cranky about it, and somebody had to go up there and get it down.
They did that while the contractors still owned the telescope, which made it especially
heinous crime. Yeah. So I remember all the same memories, Dan Golden rushing out and all of that. I think my main memory is I'm just glad that the day went well. It was really a lovely day, and I was really incredibly happy for all of you that had worked so hard on it. And I was just kind of proud of what we had done as an organization. That's probably all I got to say.
Yeah, Tony, that's the other vivid memory I have of that day was after it was all over, Jim Bratz came up to me and said, Mark, I've really been proud to be an NRAO employee today. It was really a special event. Okay. Anything else any questions on dedication before we transition to the commissioning of the telescope, which was a Herculean effort? Okay, there being none, I want to recognize Ron and his team, particularly Dana and Frank, on getting this telescope commissioned. They're the guys who did all the heavy lifting. And Ron, if I could maybe turn it over to you to share some of your memories of that time.
Sure. Thank you, Mark. Yeah, so the commissioning team, we had essentially 4 folks, myself, Glenn Langston, Dana Balser, and Frank Ghigo. And we were definitely understaffed. I can definitely get to say that. So I'm going to lay out the timeline. The dedication was late August. The acceptance testing had been done, but the telescope had yet to be fully outfitted. So, and other than that one pulsar observation, there were no other observations of any astronomical objects until January of 2001. And that's when the rubber hit the road as far as trying to get the telescope to actually do astronomy. And we were ill prepared. We did not, for example, one of the things you need to do is measure a focus tracking curve and a pointing curve. We didn't even have the software to take the data, let alone analyze it, let alone put it into the system and implement it. So we were scurrying pretty hectically, trying to get all these components together that are necessary to get an actual working telescope that you can use for general purpose astronomy. And we had a deadline because we knew that in April we were going to try these Venus radar runs. So, so it was a very full time for the 4 of us. We couldn't work during the week. We couldn't do any testing during the day because that's when the engineers and the software folks were doing their things. So the only time that we actually had to work on the telescope were nights and weekends. And we also had our own, we were also having to come to meetings and doing everything else during daytime hours. So we were doing 60 to 70 hour work weeks, each one of us. We would meet every day in what we call the war room, which was where the observers' offices were. There's been some rearranging in the Jansky lab, but we used to meet every day, every afternoon, to discuss the observations we made the previous night, what they meant, who was going to write what memos, and then what observations and how to do those observations for the coming night. And then we split up the work so that everyone wouldn't be too overwhelmed by all this work. Commissioning happened in the servo room, and everyone who ever has worked for the commission in that servo room knows it's one of the worst working environments. We should have gotten hazard pay for working there, because I'm going to try to show my screen. I got a couple of pictures, if I can find them. Nope, don't want to do that. Come on. All right. I can't find it. Here we go. I'll just try this. All right. All right. Nope, you're not seeing my screen. It's not seeing the application. There we go. There we go. All right. So this is what the server room looked like. This is the actual morning of the first radar observations of Venus. Okay. So that's me on the left. Donna Strickland is our operator, Joe Brent from the software division, and Dana Balser on the right. And you'll see on Dana's screen, you'll see on Dana's screen this graph, which is probably one of our first pointings on Venus that were ever done with the GBT. It's a bad environment because you see those big boxes that are behind us. To the left of us were the boxes which held all the transformers for the azimuth counterclockwise rotation of the telescope. To the right of us were boxes which controlled the rotation of the telescope in the other direction, and behind us are boxes that control the elevation drives. And these things hummed as if you were in a storm of bees. And as the drives moved and as the telescope shifted, going from azimuth to elevation, each drive would increase its volume and its tone. So it was like sitting in a beehive with the bees moving through your head all the time. The magnetic field in these rooms was so high that the CRT screens that we were looking at, when the drives turned on, they would all sort of shimmer and shake. Then you have to ask, where the heck is the bathroom? Well, the bathroom is about 1,000 feet away. To get on and off the telescope, we would be getting on and off a moving structure. And so if you, currently, if you look at the steps to get you on and off the GBT, the lower two steps didn't exist. And so at some points in azimuth, you would have to hike yourself up on the GBT. There would be like a 4 or 5 foot gap between the ground and that first step. And so we had to learn how to get on and off a moving telescope. And it was an interesting time doing this in this environment. We did this for 18 months because after the first Venus observations, we also went into a sort of a hiatus of astronomical observing. So it was a very, 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 very full 18 months of working 60-hour work weeks, many of those hours being inside this horrible environment. So I'm going to pause at that point, and I'll see whether or not Dana, Frank, Glenn, Tony, and others who were working in that environment want to say something about what we were doing in there and whatever.
Yeah, I can chime in, Ron. So my memory is very similar to yours. I forgot some of the details about getting on and off the telescope. But I'd like to just tell one little story about related to the servo room, even though it was kind of miserable in the ways you describe. The one advantage, which is related to the story I want to tell, is related to the fact that you could really feel the telescope in the servo room. And so, as everyone knows, because the GBT is this offset design, it has this big feed arm that's hanging off the structure. And so people were worried about when we would go to a source that this feed arm would be oscillating and it would cause problems. And so before the telescope could move, the people used the accelerometers and the laser rangefinders to kind of measure the oscillation, and we're able to see the fundamental modes of the telescope at 0.6 and 0.8 hertz. But when we got started doing commissioning, we could move the telescope, and we did a little experiment measuring the half power point, if you remember, and we would just track the half power point of a really bright source. And so any kind of intensity changes would relate to pointing offsets or tracking errors. And what we noticed is that we saw those same fundamental nodes, and we saw a much larger variation at much lower frequencies, which seemed to be related to the servo system. And I think many years later, Tim Whedon tracked this down to an encoder problem, a precision of the encoders, and maybe he'll talk about that later. But anyhow, because of this, Don Wells, I think, wrote some software to minimize the jerking of the telescope when you would slew from one place to the next. So on one of these commissioning nights, as you described very, very nicely, I can't remember exactly who was there, but I know Joe Brandt was there because he had to switch the software over to test this new software, which would basically minimize the jerking as we would move from one source to the next. The problem is the minute we turned it on, all of a sudden the telescope started shaking. And it was a really kind of terrifying feeling. And I think at least me and other people just kind of yelled for the operator, who I think was Nathan Sharp, but I could be wrong there, to just, hit the kill switch, stop it. And what he did, and the telescope just kind of shook at that point and stopped. So I basically had to get out of the room because I needed some fresh air. And so while Joe Brandt and the operator were getting out of this hard stop, which is what we did, I kind of walked on the walkway. Remember, sometimes you could take a break and go for a little walk on the walkway. And I noticed the lights were on at the laser rangefinders. So I walked over there. I don't know if Dave, who I think is on, remembers this, but Dave Parker and John Shelton were there. They were working very late. And I walk over there and Dave says, "What the hell are you guys doing?" And I said, "What? What do you mean?" And it turns out that the telescope was kind of oriented towards them, and it was tilted so that the arm was right above them. And when we did that hard stop, the telescope, looked like it was going to fall down on top of them. So when he asked me what we were doing, I said we were testing some software, and he said, "Well, stop doing that." And so we did. But anyhow, so it was an interesting story, kind of an exciting night. But it was one advantage to being in the servo room is I think we really could feel the telescope, although there were lots of disadvantages, as you, I think, nicely described.
Good story.
Hey, Ron, I'd like to interject. I think you guys did a fantastic job because the focus curves, pointing curves you guys came up with were spectacular. And the thing that just really blew me away is when you did the first beam cuts and showed that the side loads were 30 dB down. It was just unheard of. And so it was doing what it was supposed to do. And the real knockout punch was the experiment you guys did to show that the active surface worked. And it was the gain curve of gain versus elevation. It was highly peaked parabolic with the system turned off. You guys turned that on, and the amount of work that went into that model, and then the gain curve after that is flat and high across all elevations. It was just a spectacular result.
Yeah, let me share my screen again because I gotta show that. One of the best things about working on the GBT, although as you said we were ill prepared, was that the GBT for many of our commissioning experiments was a theoretical telescope. That means it behaved exactly as a perfect telescope should behave. The focus tracking curve had no surprises. We had to derive one, but there were no surprises. The pointing curve had no surprises. And that was due to a lot of work done by lots of people in the design, construction of the telescope. And so, let me share. I can figure, there we go. Go ahead. Here we go. Okay. Okay, so there's us. This is the little celebration we had after that Venus run. All right, so this is one of the experiments we did. This was about 2 years after we were given the keys to the telescope, when we turned on the active surface for the first time. On the right-hand side is what the telescope's beam profile looked like. And you'll see these huge side lobes. And there was so much work that had to be done, but when we first turned on the active surface, this is the first astronomical experiment where we turned on the active surface, we got that measurement on the left. And you can see that those side lobes are completely gone, like they should have been. And the peak efficiency of the telescope went from 2.7 to 5.7. Just a remarkable accomplishment by everyone who worked on the active surface, the design, the FEM model. All this stuff was done, so it actually worked. It is so much true that the GBT is a theoretical telescope that this is the beam profile at 100. This was, we did this at, I think, 22 gigahertz, right? This is the beam profile at 109 gigahertz. And the black is the measurement, and the red is the theoretical. This is not a model fit. This is the theoretical beam profile that lies right on top of the measured full width half maximum. So even at 110 gigahertz, this telescope has remained a theoretical performance. And that's because a lot of people have done lots of work behind the scenes.
Hey, if I could talk for a second. Dana, you were talking about when you hit the e-stop, everything just shook all to pieces. And that was before we required Lockheed Martin to actually replace the brakes. So at that time, when you hit the e-stop, all the brakes would set immediately, actually within 10 milliseconds. And we redesigned those brakes so that they would come on in sequence. So today you can hit an e-stop, or if you're slewing and running full speed, it'll slow down mechanically properly without shaking the antenna.
Yeah, thanks for that, Tim. I didn't appreciate that.
Yeah, that was one thing we did. And the other thing was on the encoder. You're referring to the encoder. And we thought it was an oscillation in the servo system. And it was about 3 years before I retired, I recalled that the NSF, when they were talking about shutting down the GBT, the advisory committee came back, and the big thing that they complained about was that we weren't observing at 100 gigahertz yet. And I said, well, we've got to fix this oscillation problem before I retire. Okay. And we were able to get the servo error down a factor of 8 of what it had been, which then allowed you to get up to 100 gig.
So it was the encoders then, right? It was.
Yes, it was. And it's not only with the encoder, but it's interesting. The encoder we had to replace it, it's a BEI. It was a $35,000 encoder. We replaced it with a $9,000 Heidenhain encoder. And then the last 2 years that we were there, Joe and I redesigned the servo system. And instead of getting you only 22 bits of an encoder, that Heidenhain was a 26-bit. So now you actually get 26 bits of information from that encoder. And between the encoder being changed, what is it, 4 times cheaper, and the fact that we can give you 26 bits instead of only 22 bits is what really allows you to get up there now in your frequency, 100 and 110 gigahertz. I mean, there's other things too, but in terms of the servo system, that was what the problem was there.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. I appreciate it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was Tim's stories on the e-stop reminds me of the high stakes poker we were playing and the acceptance of the telescope. The actual acceptance, we will specification that the telescope would survive an emergency stop at full speed. And so we said, okay, let's test it. And Lockheed Martin says, we don't want to do that because we don't know what's going to happen. And we said, well, okay, we'll cut you some slack. If you guys can do a controlled slow stop, we'll go with that. Well, they looked into it and it was too expensive, and they said, okay, have it your way. You guys can do the hard stop. And okay, they called our bluff, and we wound up putting in the soft stop. Thanks for that, Tim.
It's not just a soft stop button, though. We had to replace all the brakes.
Right.
We required them.
Right.
Well, at some point, Mark, probably not right now, just because I know where we are running over and we're going to keep going here. But Dave Parker put a remarkable comment in the chat about putting grease on the track for
that was
Dave,
fun.
We've got to get back to that. If we don't get to it now, we need to do it later, because I'm not sure I know that story and I want it recorded for the record at some point.
Yeah, let me come back to that.
Chestnut and I are the ones that found that.
Yeah. Yeah. So
I just say Pete Chestnut and I found that. Good.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks, Tim. We put a teaser here in the title of this session.
Oh, yes.
So Ron, you want to relay that story?
Sure. There were a couple of surprises. For example, during commissioning, one was when we started moving the telescope. These are low frequency L-band, 1 gigahertz or below observation. Every time we moved the telescope, we would see what looked like noise in the data. So you move the telescope, you see noise. You stop the telescope, the noise goes away. You start it up again, you see the noise. So originally we thought that was RFI being generated by the drive system. You turn the drives on, turn them off, turn it on, turn it off. In reality, what we were seeing was the fact that the GBT is so damn sensitive. We were seeing astronomical sources, right? It only took milliseconds to see these astronomical sources because the sky is just full of them. And so that was quite a big surprise for me, because most telescopes don't have that sensitivity, and they don't to actually see these things in a strip chart recording. And the other thing, so the sharks story was, so this is probably January or February, when we were doing nighttime observing. What we would see on our strip chart was something that looked like a shark's profile. So here you go along, all of a sudden it would increase and then snap down to 0. And this would happen every, tens of minutes. Up, snap down. So it looked like a shark fin, right? Bang. And so we would see these things over and over again. And we had no clue as to what was going on, but we saw more of them at night than during the day. So we surmised it probably was some electrical switch that had a dirty contact or something. Switch starts turning on, turns on, starts turning on, and then it finally makes full contact, right? And so the switch was basically, as the switch gets closer and closer, it arcs and arcs and arcs until it finally meets. And so what we found was a heater in the warehouse that you want to keep the place warm, so you leave heaters on during the night. And so it was basically a heater that was, whose switch was just dirty enough that we would see this stuff and then click, it would just. And so that took a few nights for us to figure out. And so basically we went around turning electrical panels off, and eventually we found an electric panel that when you turned off, made the sharks go away. And we figured out that was the particular heater that was doing it.
Yeah, there was, Ron, there was my recollection of that was slightly different in that the construction workers had built these little shacks all around the perimeter of the telescope. They put space heaters in them and then leave them on overnight, and they would never turn them off. And so we had Wes Sizemore get his little RFI sniffer, and it was more than one. It was multiple heaters that were causing the shark fins.
Thanks.
Hey, let me switch gear to the point about Dave Parker and the grease on the track. Dave, you want to tell that story?
Yeah, okay. The way I remember it, there was that spec that they had to meet, and I remember Bob Hall telling the contractor, he said, "I forbid you to do that test." It was, I don't know how it got in the specs, but it's like saying that a freight train, say, had to stop on a dime, it's just impossible. but they did it anyway because it was in the specs. Well, they tried it, and this is my recollection. Somebody may correct me here, but it actually slid across the track in the azimuth when they hit the brakes and skidded feet. So they said, oh, it's got grease on the track. No wonder we didn't meet the spec. So they actually cleaned the track back to bare metal, ran it again. And of course it still skidded, but not as far. And, you know, the thought of that just scared the hell out of me. I mean, we built the thing and I could just see the thing laying on the ground, you know. Now, some of the others may, I think Tim was working with them on the testing and acceptance testing, but there's a lesson there. I think when you write the specifications for these things, the contractors take them literally. So you better be careful about putting something like that in, you know, be careful what you wish for.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, Dave, we also, so the grease was on the track to protect it over the course of construction from welding, slag, dirt, whatever. And we had to take the grease off anyway for the lightning arresters to go to ground.
Yeah, I'd forgotten about the lightning arresters, but yeah. But it sat there for years. If they had not coated it, it would have been a bucket of rust, you know, so, yeah.
Yep. So I am running a little behind. Maybe we can shift gears now from commissioning to outfitting. And Bob Simon, you still online? Bob had some slides he wanted to show.
Yes, I'm here. Let me try this. So just quick, I've got 4 slides to show. So a big part of my job, starting in really the mid 90s, was to get involved with some of the cryogenics. Roger Nord at the time came to me and we talked about cryogenics, and at the 140 foot, perpetual leaks were always a problem. The tubing, the stainless steel tubing for cryogenics, which pipes the helium gas from the compressor to the refrigerator, used a compression fitting at every joint. And over time, vibration, you would have all these leaks at every mechanical joint. So you'd have Ron and Don Gordon grab a couple giant wrenches, and maybe once a month they would go through the entire 140 foot or 300 foot and tighten all these fittings. Early on in the GBT, it was evident that we were looking at, you know, 9,200 feet of tubing, and with hundreds and hundreds of these potential leaks, that was not going to be possible. So we studied what alternatives we could do, and we had a group of us get together and we talked about it, and in the end we bought an orbital TIG welder. So I went from electronics to welder pretty quickly, and we started.
Now, Bob, if you're trying to share a screen, we're not seeing anything.
Oh, okay. Let me back up real quick. So I'm here. Are you seeing this screen? Yes.
Still not, we're just seeing you.
All right.
There we go.
You've been hearing my audio at least.
Yeah, we've been hearing your audio and seeing your face, so that's good.
Okay, so that was the setup. We needed a better method of not having leaks. So if you can see my mouse moving here at the base of the telescope, that's where the compressor room is, and we had to get gas up to the top of the feed arm. So it's about 150 feet from here to this 4th level, the top of the alidade, and then you go out the walkway and up the elevator track. So that took us, Jonah Balserman and Tom Bailey and myself spent about 2 years. obviously it was hard to work in the wintertime, but over the course of a few summers, whenever we could, we would do this work. One big issue was getting the tubing up the upper elevator track, because the upper elevator didn't exist at that point. So we were faced with, how do you install these stainless steel tubes up that 200-foot track without an elevator? So we climbed it. So there's a picture of me with mustache. And we would hoist these, we would weld the tubing on the ground at 20-foot lengths, and we'd get this 200-foot length. And then we had a 1,000-foot rope and pulley system, and we would literally haul this giant piece of stainless tubing all the way up into position. And then generally Jonah and I would walk up the steps, because again, no elevator. So harnesses on one, you'd walk up the steps, and you would step off of the landing and stand on the track and tie in. And then you would work your way down to clamp all these tubing in place. There was some debate early on whether we wanted to have valves and fittings and pressure gauges and things like that. I and a few others argued that we should have minimal connections. So it's really, other than the elevation wrap in a flex line inside the receiver room, it's a continuously, each of the 6 lines are continuously welded. And it's worked. To date, I don't think we've had any leaks. Obviously, the price of helium was a big concern even back in the late 90s. We realized we didn't want to continually buy helium to recharge the lines and things like that. So that seems to have worked. A thing that went hand in hand with this was we also had problems in the day with the compressors leaking oil. These are oil lubricated scroll compressors, and occasionally they would dump oil into the helium gas stream and contaminate the lines. That's a big effort to clean out, run solvents through the lines on, say, the 140 foot. But again, with so much length on the GBT, that wasn't practical. So Steve White sort of led the effort to look into the compressors at the time and try to understand why this gas would occasionally get contaminated with oil. And it was largely a matter of filtering, just beefing up all the oil separating filters. But to date, we haven't had any problem with the contamination or leaking. So that's all good. I only have 2 more slides. So the other big effort was the fiber. When the decision was made to move the control room from there was discussions to have the control room at the base of the GBT. Ultimately, it's up in the lab when the USNO put their stamp of approval on that. So suddenly we were faced at a few kilometers of distance between the GBT and the control room. So we decided pretty early on that it had to be fiber. So several people, Roger, Ed Childers at the time, I'm sure Steve White, we looked at all the requirements. And so we came up with everything we could as far as how many fibers you actually needed. And we doubled the number. And so we ended up, instead of 54, which we thought we needed, we bought a cable with 108 fibers. And we put that in. Rusty Taylor and his crew buried conduit and pull boxes between the lab and the GBT. And then they installed the fiber and spooled up the excess at the GBT. It was pretty obvious early on that we needed it or we wanted it to be one continuous piece without any splices or connections. That was largely driven through phase and gain instability. So if we avoided any sort of splices or anything, that was deemed beneficial. So we had it, this 10,000 foot fiber that we had purchased, and we had 1,000 feet or so on the ground at the GBT. And I was more or less tasked to, okay, now you have to get it up through the structure. So I can remember talking with Mark McKinnon, and Mark was saying, how long is this going to take? Because it had an impact on everybody's schedule. And I thought we could do it in 2 or 3 days at best. Well, it turns out we rounded up probably 15 or 20 people and put people at every intersection on the cable trays that we could. And we took it just like a needle and thread, and we went up through the pintle wrap. It goes in and out of the servo room, and then it winds its way up the structure to the receiver room. Turns out that was done in one afternoon. It took about 4 hours to get through. So that works, and we still use that today. I will note that within a few months, we had maxed out on our 108 fibers that we thought would last forever. And just a few years ago, we pulled another one in a similar manner. It's 288 fibers, and it may not be enough. So you can never have enough fibers. And then the last picture there is storms. Outfitting, whether you're an iron worker, welder, or me and my group, quite often when you're in a harness, it might take you a half hour to get off the telescope, depending on where you're at and how you have to climb out. So weather was always something that any of us that worked on the telescope had to deal with, particularly in the springtime, because these storms pop up so quick. So Donnie Ritter, who was the lifting superintendent for ComSat, he spent a lot of time in the office during his job, but he was sort of our lead weather guy and always paid attention to the radar and would try to give us a heads up. And usually you could manage that. But I do remember this lower plot there that says Wednesday, the 9th of August. We were at the receiver room level welding the cryo tubing. And so we had all of our equipment out and scattered around and all our tools. And there were a group of iron workers up there doing their thing. And it was one of those hot, muggy days. And no one was really paying attention, but I can remember Jonah, I believe it was Jonah Balser, turned to me and he said, it was like, oh my God, look at what's coming over Cheat Mountain. And it was just a wall of black heading our way. About that time, Donnie Ritter got on the radio and said, everyone run for your lives. And so a few people went in the receiver room, shut the door and sat down on the floor, probably praying. Me and my crew decided to make a run for it. So I got maybe one flight of stairs down from the receiver room when this 56-mile-an-hour gust of wind hit. And it's quite literally like just stepping out of your car as you drive down the interstate. I sat down on the steps and had my harness on, so I tied off to the railings and just sat there. Eventually, my hard hat ended up in the field across the road from the GBT, and parts were scattered everywhere. And everyone was safe, everyone was alive, no damage was done. A few days later, I was talking to Donnie, and his biggest concern more than anything was the tower cranes. These were the 4 big 200 or 300 foot cranes around the GBT. And he said he couldn't imagine how they stayed up. They had no rating to stay up in that sort of a wind gust. So he was concerned. He thought for sure that those were going to come down and wasn't so worried about the GBT as it is. And then last picture. So we do have some fun occasionally.
Yeah, we're not, oh, there we go.
Got it. So we do have some things. We had a legitimate concern. There was something, I don't remember, maybe Tim or Steve, if he's the one that remembers, but we had some instability that seemed to be related to elevation, tipping in elevation in the receiver room. And so somehow, I don't know how, we convinced Jody that we needed to get in the receiver room and ride it as it tipped down to 5 degrees. So you can see Tim and Bob Simmons and Steve sitting near the ceiling on the duct at the top of the turret. I've got a ladder on the wall laying on the floor, and I climbed up the floor to take that picture. So that's it from me. So
thank you, Bob.
Love that picture, Bob. I was so jealous when you guys did that.
Yeah, that was, I got 2 comments on what Bob said before I turn it over to Rich. One was on that automatic TIG welder. Bob lobbied me really hard to get that done. I didn't want to spend the money because it was really expensive, but I gave in, and man, was that ever the right thing to do. It, for the technical reasons Bob mentioned, and also the work, it just got done a whole lot faster. The other thing I'll mention on the fiber, to be clear, you know, that's one continuous pull from the receiver room to the Jansky lab. That was done in 2 steps. First, it was between the pedestal room and the Jansky lab because the contractor wouldn't let us take it up the telescope. And we kind of went back and forth. They didn't want us doing it, but I give Larry D'Addario the credit for this. He came to my office and said, Mark, you have got to get that fiber up to the receiver room. You can't do anything to make this work unless you get that up. And I really drug my feet on it because it was just so contentious with the contractor. And so there's this huge spool of fiber down in the pedestal room just waiting for them to say go. And so they finally let us do it. And as Bob relayed, we got it done in less than a day. And had we not done that, all these things we've talked about since, it just would not have happened. And so it was fantastic. Rich, I'm thinking you're going to talk about active surface.
Well, I can, yeah. We've got a lot of not much time to talk, but I guess I can mention a few things. The overriding theme is that there were a lot of bumps along the road of getting the active surface done. The actuators were custom, the motors were custom, the LVDTs were custom, and the first of everything always has a problem. We did our due diligence and checked them for several thousand hours before we ordered a large quantity of anything. But they worked fine. Let me take that back. Bob Hall made one of the best calls he did as far as I was concerned. He said that we need to buy actuators from 4 or 5 different manufacturers and test them out for a long time before we buy anything. And one of the questions was, how long is long enough? We were lucky enough to have Jay Lockman and John Payne independently figure out how many inches of motion we could expect the actuators to move over 20 years. And they came out pretty close. So we believed them. And that was an example also of every time we ran into a problem that we couldn't handle, we'd ask somebody and they would just jump in and help. And most of my stories are how somebody helped us out. Fred Cruz, the machine shop, Lenny Howell, Martin Barkley. It just went on and on, how many people helped us out. It was amazing.
I remember the freezers in the basement that had your actuators in them, I think.
Yeah, Dwayne checked all 2,400 of those LVDT position measuring things in there for cheap. He bought a Sears freezer instead of a $3,000 environmental chamber. Everything we did had 2,400 of something. So if you had a problem, you had 2,400 problems.
Thanks a lot, Rich. And before I transition away from this topic, there's one other thing I wanted to add. There was the outfitting of the telescope itself, but there was also a lot of site work that I tip my hat to Mike Holstine. Mike had to step out for a bit, but the GBT, well, the Green Bank site looks very different now than what it did at the time. The big fence that's out there now, Mike's team took care of that. We also had to relocate the road around the structure. And we also decided to operate the GBT from the Jansky lab. And the operations crew said, well, I got to see the telescope. And so there's that big swath of land. It used to be a forest. And Mike arranged for a local logging contractor to come in and clear the forest between the lab and the telescope. And that's the view you see today. That was our guys that did that. Okay. Sue Ann, I'm going to go ahead with Jay's talk. Is that all right?
Let's just take the temperature in the room here for a minute. I know that people need to get up and take a little break before 2 o'clock starts, and we have to start promptly because Jean-Luc has teaching responsibilities today. We don't want to keep him out of it. So Jay, if you are in the room, cool. How do you, go ahead.
I'm in a hotel room and I'm expecting a delivery of lunch that I have to go down and pick up.
Yeah, well, let's go ahead. I think we should break now. And Jay, I can chat with you offline about a good time to give that talk.
Okay.
Maybe it could be tonight. I don't know if you're traveling tonight or tomorrow. I forget.
No, I'm around all day today.
Okay, I think it might be good for our happy hour in addition to Dan. And the whole purpose of, part of the purpose of that talk was just to remind everybody of what we thought the science might be at the time, because our next sessions are organized by those science themes. So Jay, I might let you say, you know, a minute's worth of intro this afternoon, but then we'll do your talk this evening, if that's all right with you.
That's fine.
Yeah, you're a good guy. So let's take a break. What do you say, Mark? And you did a fantastic job of moderating and got so many more stories out than I thought we would. So good job.
No, my apologies to Jay for going over. Jay, I'm sorry about that. But thanks.
No.
We want the stories.
Yeah, really.